Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Scott Rasmussen. Scott has been on the show before. And Scott, you are a regular in the world of politics and polling and trying to understand what happens. So it's great to have you here. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Jeff. Great to be back.
So let's talk first about polls versus surveys. That's sometimes something that people, I think, confuse in our political world. They hear a poll, they hear the word survey, they think it's all the same things. For instance, maybe Elon Musk puts up a survey on X and then someone reports it out as a poll. So what's the difference? What's the formal difference between a poll and a survey?
Well, we like to talk about there are scientific polls and then there are fun surveys like what you mentioned with Elon Musk. In fact, during this election season, when we would put out one of our polls, sometimes people would reply with, "Oh, look, we did this on X and 70% of our followers supported Trump. What's wrong with your poll?" The biggest difference is your sample. If you are taking a survey that has been posted by Elon Musk, you are more likely to be right-leaning than the population at large because that's who his audience is. Ballotpedia is probably the only online political platform that has a good representative mix of the population. Everybody else, you have your followers. Now, when we do a survey, the challenge is, how do you actually get a good mix of people? And that is the hardest part of the work. Just one simple example. People who have a postgraduate degree like to take surveys more than other voters. What's wrong with that? Well, people with a postgraduate degree voted for Kamala Harris overwhelmingly. Harris won by 30 points among postgrads. So if you have too many of them in your survey, you're going to see it skew in one direction or the other. Another example is people who live in rural districts, the most rural, who have fewer than 250 people per square mile in their zip code. Well, you know what? They tend to be more right-leaning than the population at large, and they tend to take surveys less than most people. So you have to make a special outreach. And ultimately, it's a very difficult process to get a good representative sample along gender, age, income, race and ethnicity, education, marital status. And that ultimately is what makes it a scientific survey.
Yeah, I remember we talked about this, I think, on our episode last year, this has gotten not necessarily easier with technology. I think if I'm remembering right, it was almost easier back when you just had landlines and you could polling industry had figured it out. Now it's a lot more complicated, even though we have theoretically more accessibility, right?
Sure. People don't remember, but back in the golden era of polling, when it was much easier than today, if you had a landline in your house, we already knew a lot about you. We knew where you lived, but just by your phone number. We knew the type of neighborhood you were in. We could really target these things much more easily. And, doesn't work that way anymore. I live in Texas these days, and my cell phone still has a New Jersey area code because that's where I got my cell phone. So it has become much more difficult.
Yeah. 973 forever.
Right. So it's much more difficult, but we're just working through things, and look, this is an ongoing process. I remember, this will date me a little bit, but I remember when one of the new technologies that was hampering pollsters were answering machines, and people began to screen calls. Something we never had before.
RID, yeah, right, yeah.
So
let's talk a little more about polling this cycle. You've talked about that the polling was pretty spot on, and what's really interesting to me is I've seen a number of news stories. I'm sure our listeners have seen them as well, that are centered around the polls were wrong. So what's with the disconnect? The polls were right, the polls are wrong. What are you seeing?
Well, there's absolutely a story here that the polls were very good. I mean, I'll start with the simplest thing. If you were watching on election night, there were no surprises. There were no big victories for either team outside of the swing states. There were no Senate races that, oh my gosh, how did this happen? We were very clear going into the election from the data. I mean, my pre-election take was Donald Trump is more likely to win than Kamala Harris. He is favored, but it was close enough to go either way. And the Republicans would end up with 52 Senate seats was my estimate. Highlighted a few places where it could go up or down and said, well, 53 is a little more likely than 51. So the data was good. And as you watched on election night, there were no surprises. I think there's a couple of things that have gone into this belief that the polls were off. Number one, the early vote totals. If you went to Real Clear Politics on the morning after the election, it showed that Donald Trump was winning the popular vote by about 3.5 points. If you believe that to be the number, well, then the polls were way off because the polls at Real Clear Politics showed it was going to be a dead heat. What's wrong with that assessment? Number one is that all the votes weren't counted. You know, California takes a long time to count their votes. A lot of the West Coast
They're still
states
counting,
will
and
be
they
counting.
still will be counting tomorrow when this comes out.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. They're still counting. And ultimately, what we expect is that Donald Trump will have won the popular vote by about a point, maybe 1.5 points. So if the polls said it was a dead heat and Donald Trump wins by a point, that's pretty good. And it wasn't just the national. Oh, I should also point out that there were 17 polls used in the Real Clear Politics average. 16 of the 17 were within 2 points of the actual result. So there weren't any real surprises there. If you go to the swing states, in the swing states, they were generally pretty good and consistent with the national numbers, perhaps understating Donald Trump by 1 percentage point. And if you expect polls to be more precise than being within 1 percentage point, you really don't understand what polling is all about.
Yeah, that goes back to the first question.
Yeah, well, in Georgia, the polls were very good. I think the average was within a point. Just about all of the polls were within a couple of points of that. In North Carolina, 8 of the 11 polls were within 2 points of the actual result. I think if you wanted to find the biggest mistake, it might have been Arizona. We'll find out when all the votes are tallied. But even in Arizona, where Trump's victory was underestimated, 9 of the 10 polls in the average showed Trump leading. The others showed a tie. Not a single poll showed Kamala Harris ahead. So if you took a look at all that, you would come up with the commentary that I did before the election. Trump was stronger in the southern swing states. He was likely to win all of those. I know the Trump team for a little while was worried about North Carolina, but overall those states were looking pretty good. And then you had 3 toss-ups in the blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And, it's easy now. You look back and say, oh, he won all 7 states. Why didn't you guys predict that? Well, he won Wisconsin by 30,000 votes out of 3+ million. Total across those 3 blue wall states, there were 17 million ballots cast, and Trump carried those 3 states by just 250,000. So they were very close. Donald Trump's victory, very significant, but it was not a landslide. In fact, at the moment, it looks like he will not even reach 50% of the popular vote.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. This is how battlegrounds go every cycle. They're toss-ups. That's the whole point of a toss-up, is that they are coin flips, so to speak. But it almost felt a little bit like that story, and this happens with lots of stories in general media coverage today, is they catch legs behind them, and then suddenly there's a snowballing effect of reporting, and I'm not even sure that subsequent reporters even know why they're reporting it. All of a sudden someone says, the polls are wrong. And if you were to say, well, why? I don't know. I read somewhere else that the polls were wrong. So now I'm going to report that the polls are wrong. It kind of felt like that's what was happening here. Did you get that sense?
Yeah, and I think we also have to remember everybody was on edge going into the election. 90% of Trump voters thought he was going to win. 90% of Harris voters thought she was going to win. Everybody was nervous that something would happen. And there was a sense of relief on the Trump side. And when he won all 7 swing states and he won the popular vote, all of a sudden it didn't feel close anymore. This, though, to give you a sense of how close it ended up, since 1888, only 3 elections that we've had since then did the winning candidate have a smaller margin of victory in the popular vote. So, this is a historically close election, but it was really good for America that it was comfortable enough to be a clear decision. And I think that euphoria, I think a lot of the Trump supporters were saying, you should have told us it was comfortable ahead of time.
Good. Yeah, I think you saw a lot of people across the aisle saying that in some respects. So let's talk about New Jersey, which you alluded to earlier. We're both from New Jersey in some respects. I've spent a lot of time there. And New Jersey, there's been a lot of talk about a number of states to cycle. And I was just kind of curious to focus on New Jersey for a bit. So Donald Trump lost New Jersey in 2016 by 14 points. He lost it by 16 points in 2020. And currently, again, vote total is not certified yet, but he's losing by 5 points now. So, now all 3 cycles, that means the Democratic candidate gets all the electoral votes for that state. I had a lot of fun explaining to my 10-year-old the concept of you get all the electoral votes, even if you only win by a little bit or a lot. It doesn't matter. He was very confused by this. So in some respects, right, New Jersey went blue like it always has, but 5 points, that's pretty close. What does that tell us about New Jersey or other states like it? What does it tell us about future elections?
Well, let's put it in context of the national election. In 2020, Joe Biden won by 4.5 percentage points. Donald Trump won this by about a percentage point. So there was nationally about a 5.5 point swing to the right. So part of that's about half of what we saw in New Jersey. We also know, despite all the criticisms of the Harris campaign, that the vice president made it closer in the swing states. The swings, the shift from 2020 to 2024 were much more modest than we would have expected from the national trend. So again, that adds a little bit more to a state like New Jersey. And I think the other part of it is, we are said this was the least racially polarized election in decades. As you began to see working class voters of all races shift more to the right, that had an impact on states like New Jersey. It had an impact in a lot of urban areas around the country. And the way I would describe it right now is what happens next in New Jersey and in all those other non-swing states depends on how the Trump administration succeeds. I think voters gave 3 priorities to the Trump team. Number 1, make the economy work for everyone. I mean, that's a huge issue in this campaign. Number 2, secure the southern border. That's been Trump's biggest issue since that infamous ride down the escalator all those years ago. And the third is return to common sense about gender identity. Voters think boys and girls are different, and they want their governments and societal institutions to stop pretending they're not. If Donald Trump makes progress on those, we may see a lasting realignment. We may see that this racial turnout that we saw in this election, with Trump doing better among young black voters, doing much better among Hispanic voters, that could last and really give the GOP an edge going forward for some time. But you don't create those mandates by winning elections. You win election, and then you have to govern well. And if you can do that, well, then you'll get another chance and have a lasting impact.
Yeah, America is definitely a pendulum swinging country. We kind of have it for a couple hundred years now, I think. Right. So what about the polls at the Senate and House level? You kind of alluded to this earlier, but there's been a lot of talk about how did polling do at the presidential level? Were there any surprises with Senate and House polls? Was it pretty much in line with what we saw presidentially? So how did those do?
Yeah, so let's talk about the Senate changes first. Joe Manchin's seat was almost certain to go to the Republicans before the day began. So that would have given the Republicans 50 seats no matter what else. There was hope among Democrats that they might be able to hang on to the Montana Senate seat, won by Tim Sheehy. But the incumbent, John Tester, could not beat the political gravity of the state. Trump winning so big, it didn't happen. And the polls showed that as well. In fact, I think my firm was the last poll to ever show Tester in a competitive situation. That was early in the summer, and then by the fall, everybody was showing Sheehy well ahead. Sure. Now, the bubble race, or the one that was people were really unclear about, was Ohio. Bernie Moreno was running against Senator Brown. Brown, just like Tester, a long-term Democratic incumbent, a state that Trump was going to win, but not by as much as Montana. We were the first to show Moreno leading in that state by just a couple of points. But it was a great example, perhaps, of the dynamics of polls. When we put out our poll in Ohio, we showed Donald Trump winning the state by 11 points and Moreno winning by 2 points. So again, Trump would have to carry him across. The New York Times came out with a poll about the same time, and this was pretty early in the process in the fall, showing Trump up by 6 in Ohio and Brown leading a little bit. And at the time I commented, this is really the dynamic. If Trump does better, Moreno will win. He did. Early on in the race, it looked like, from all the polling, that Republicans in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were going to lose pretty significantly. 4 or 5 points, 6 points. And then, they began to run these ads about you shouldn't let biological males play in women's sports. They began to get traction, and the polling showed all of those races getting tighter down the stretch to the point where they were toss-ups with perhaps a little bit of favor in the Democrats' direction. Yeah. And the way that we categorized that was that all three of these, it was possible to imagine the Republicans winning, but not really likely, that they were clearly the underdogs. And that was the difference between, do you get to 52 seats or 53? And in fact, in Pennsylvania, the R's picked up a seat. The other two, the Democrats, held on. And we end up with 53 seats. So it was pretty good there. Democrats early on had hoped that they would pick up Rick Scott's seat, which was never really a serious possibilities, Rick Scott in Florida. They also had thought they had a shot at Ted Cruz, and a couple of things went wrong there. Cruz also began focusing on the issue of letting biological males play women's sports, forced his opponent, Colin Howard, to come out and say, no, he didn't support that at all. That upset the progressive base in the state. And then on top of that, Donald Trump just did very well in these borders, as he did in a lot of the border states. So that race wasn't as close as the Democrats might have hoped. Both parties have these states they dream of flipping. And every time they think it's going to flip this year, and most of the time they're disappointed. But Jeff, one thing I'd like to point out to everybody, we talk about these states, red, blue, purple, like they were written into the Constitution. I voted for the first time in 1976. And if you were to go back and look at that electoral college map, you would be shocked. All of the West Coast states, and pretty much everything west of the Mississippi, were Republican. California, Oregon, Washington, New England was Republican. The southern states were Democratic, including Texas and Florida. That didn't happen from one election to the next. Yeah. Bit by bit over time, changes in the electoral coalitions began to shift things. I would expect that if the Trump administration has a successful term, even a modestly successful term, we will see a different group of swing states in 2028 than we had this year.
Yeah, you're right. The history of studying all those states is always really fascinating. And speaking of the future, then the 2026 Senate map, is something that's going to come up quite a bit in the coming days and weeks and months ahead, because when one election cycle ends, another begins, sort of like a phoenix rising from the ashes. And the 2026 map is really interesting. We published some data about this in the Daily Brew on Monday, that there are quite a few seats that are well outside of what you'd likely consider battleground range, and there's only a handful that are really in a toss-up if you purely look at what was the margin of victory in these races the last time they came up. So, and Republicans have some prime pickup opportunities in 26. They have Georgia, which is John Ossoff's seat. They have Michigan, which will likely be another toss-up again. Some of the seats that the Democrats would look to take would be, maybe Iowa, maybe Maine, maybe North Carolina. States that typically aren't usually toss-up. So do you have any early sense of what you're seeing in 26's Senate map?
Typically, the team that has the White House does poorly in the midterms.
Yep.
So the first priority for the Republicans is going to be how can we hang on to the Senate majority? And it's impossible to predict what will happen because we don't know how the Trump administration is going to perform. Back in 2008, Barack Obama had his historic victory. And 2 years later, we had the Tea Party movement where the Republicans picked up more than 60 seats in the House. We were doing generic ballot polling every week at that time. Generic ballot is, if the election were held today, would you vote for the Republican or the Democrat from your district? And the tipping point moment came when Barack Obama passed his stimulus package without a single Republican vote. And his line was, elections have consequences. And there was a lot of opinion journalism at that time saying the Republicans made a mistake and Republicans in the House by unanimously voting against this incredibly popular package that Barack Obama had presented. And yet in our polling the next week after the Republicans were unified, we saw them begin to gain in the generic ballot and take the lead for the very first time in that cycle. And I think it was because discouraged Republican voters thought the GOP finally gave them something to fight for, something to believe in. So I bring that up because somewhere in the first 100 or so days of the Trump administration, we'll begin to get a sense of how Democrats are responding, as to how the economy is going. And those things will impact all of our discussions. But going back to way back in our conversation, talking about New Jersey, there's been a shift in the electorate. The shift is making the Republicans more of a working class party. And that shift is going to impact the 26th cycle as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so what do we learn from polling then to sort of wrap up? What do you see changing, if anything, in 6 and 28 is, for instance, what's the impact that AI might have on the polling industry? If you added a little predictive magic, what do you see coming ahead?
Oh, there's lots of changes, some of which we're working on developing, which I will tell you about after we have developed them. But I think what's going to be the biggest questions are going to be what kind of quotas do you seek? What kind of weighting of your sample is appropriate? The polls that were most favorable to Kamala Harris in this cycle appear to have had too many post-grads in their sample. Some polling firms don't weight or don't set quotas based on education. Given the huge divide by education, I think that's a mistake. So we'll see a lot of those debates play out. And most of it will be stuff that numbers geeks like me will get excited about and get wrapped up and invested in the debate. And people who have, better things to do with their life won't know that it's going on, but hopefully we'll get a handle on things. I also would point out, just in terms of the broader history of polling, I think what's changed in the last few years is not that polling has gotten worse. I actually think it's gotten better. It's harder, but it's gotten better. The expectations have changed. Back in that first election I voted in, where Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford, the last Gallup poll showed Ford up. Nobody thought it was a crisis in polling because it was expected to be very close. In Bill Clinton's re-election bid in 1996, the polls were off by far more than they've been off in recent years. In Barack Obama's re-election bid, they underestimated Barack Obama's margin by 3 points. So I think the polling industry itself has to work on improving the process and figuring out some of these issues. And believe me, it is harder and harder to fight fake responses, harder and harder to find good samples. But I think the other thing we need to do, and places like Ballotpedia are probably going to have to play a role in it, is to remind people that polls are not a precision tool. If you have a state like Wisconsin, where it's 30,000 votes deciding the outcome out of more than 3 million cast, using a poll to predict who's going to win that race is like using a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. It's just the wrong tool. What you should expect from polls is to get a good sense of the dynamics. Where are the races that we should be watching? What are the key demographic groups we should be looking for to set the stage for the election, and then see what happens from there.
Yeah, and it's trend data that matters, right? Directionality. You know, you're not just looking at one poll at a time. It's a series over a long-term sample. That's what's really most informative coming out of it, right?
It is. You know, every now and then when you do, because I do lots of polls, and a polling theory says that 1 out of 20 polls you do is going to be outside the margin of error. So there are lots of times we see surprising data. Something else that happens, if you have a smaller subset, say, black voters, well, the margin of error is much bigger for a smaller subset like that. So we might see some polling data that looks really shocking among black voters on a particular topic. If it seems inconsistent with other data that we have, we don't bury that. We publish that, but we don't make a big deal out of it. We then run another poll to see if something has changed. So it is that trend, and it's also considering all of the data that's out there. What do we know? What have we seen before? And if something seems outside the norm, you don't say the world has changed. You go to test it to see if it was an outlier, or maybe you find out sometimes the world really has changed.
Yeah. Well, we're going to learn a lot. And like you said, I think it's going to be all informed by future events that we haven't quite seen unfold yet. And we'll have to see what happens to this great country. So, Scott, thanks so much for your time today. Always great to see you. And we'll catch you on the show sometime soon.
Look forward to it, Jeff. And I imagine the team at Ballotpedia is pretty worn out from the last few months. So hope you all get some rest along the way.
Indeed. Yeah. Never stops. But yeah, believe it or not, and I'll just end on this. A number of state legislators are already sworn in. I mean, in some states, the election happens and they get sworn in within a few days. So, everyone remembers that Congress, they get sworn in January, but state legislatures, we're going right into action there. So, one election ends, next one begins. So, Scott, great to see you. And for listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode on where things stand in the race for the House. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Halley, and thanks for listening.